Hello and good afternoon, everyone. So today, group three, which is Lonnie, Manny, Seda, myself, and Betty, will be presenting the impact of notification and anonymity on racial bias. So the main research question that we were trying to test was, are people more likely to express their racial bias when they're aware that it is the purpose of the experiment and or if they are anonymous? So we were looking for two things, whether or not it mattered as if they knew if it was the purpose of our experiment or if we knew that it was them who was answering the questions, if we knew their name and their identity. So the importance of our research question is basically how significantly the bias of people can impact their attitudes and behaviors towards others. And I feel like in society, that's a huge issue and a big reason why our research question is important, because implicit bias can lead to decisions in workplace environments or schools or just day-to-day interactions that can affect people, which can affect our society. Social desirability is also another aspect of our experiment and what we are testing to see, because social desirability is the tendency for people to present themselves in a favorable way. And very interestingly, in the article, Less Biased Yet More Defensive, the impact of control processes, they basically describe how training to reduce racial bias can sometimes lead to people actually acting defensively and can potentially undermine the effectiveness of anti-bias interventions. So interestingly enough, this point foreshadows some of our results, which you will see later in the experiment. Basically, when people were trained on not to be racially biased, they turned out to be actually, in fact, more racially biased, and their stigma showed more, which is something we were trying to see on whether or not that would happen in our participants as well. So the independent variables that we chose was whether or not the group is provided information about implicit bias and the negative results of implicit bias. So basically, this independent variable group was notified or not notified about the implicit bias, the racial bias that we were testing. Independent variable two, so group two, is whether or not the subjects are anonymous. So some subjects or groups would be anonymous, we wouldn't know who is answering, and other groups would not be anonymous and we would know who is answering and their identity. The dependent variable, or what we were measuring, is the comparison of scores. In particular, we were using the symbolic racism scale by Henry and Sears in 2002 between both independent variable groups.
For our independent variable 1 is notified, the participants in the notified group, such as groups 1 and 2, were shown a 2-minute video about bias entitled "Bias Isn't Just a Police Problem, It's a Preschool Problem" from NPR, in which implicit bias in preschool teachers is discussed. However, the participants in the not notified groups, such as groups 3 and 4, were shown a 1-minute and 30-second video about the history of baseball entitled "How to Play Baseball," in which the rules of baseball are briefly reviewed and there is no mention of implicit bias or racism. Next, for our independent variable 2 is anonymous. Participants in the not anonymous groups, such as groups 1 and 3, were asked to provide their names in the survey, and there was no verbiage around anonymity. And next, participants in the anonymous groups, like groups 2 and 4, were not asked to provide their names or any identifying information. In place of the questions requesting their names, participants were asked, "Do you like baseball?" And next we include verbiage in their questionnaire that stated that all answers provided will be kept anonymous. Then we have 3 additional questions. First one, participants in all groups were provided with additional questions from the Martin Sexism Scale and the Marlowe-Crown Scale. The second question is the Martin Sexism Scale questions were included in order to obscure the purposes of the experiment, as we did not want the participants to discern the purpose of the experiments. The last question is the Marlowe-Crown scales. Questions were administrated in order to factor in the effect of social desirability on additional questionnaires. Then we have our hypotheses. First one for the hypothesis for IV1 is participants exposed to information about implicit bias prior to testing will report significantly lower levels of stigma compared to those who are not exposed to this information. For hypothesis for IV2, participants will believe their answers are not anonymous, will report significantly lower levels of stigma than those who believe their responses are anonymous. And hypothesis for interaction, no interaction is expected between our IVs.
So in order to turn our questions into something tangible that we can measure, based off of implicit racial bias, we needed to use a scale to measure it and turn the choices that people picked into something that we can measure. That's where the symbolic racism scale comes in. It's basically 8 questions that were developed from previous studies based on different themes like work ethic and responsibility for outcomes, excessive demands, denial of continuing discrimination, and underserved advantages, with 2 items from each of the 4 scales. So basically each of the questions had 4 different points that the participants could achieve. And based off of the points, we calculated them and turned them into something we could add up and measure after seeing the study. So these are an example of some of the questions that we asked. As you can see, a few of them, like number 1, the answer choices started from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And basically that is our way of measuring their implicit racial bias, because all those points were going to be added up at the end of the study, so we could have results. So aside from the symbolic racism scale, the social desirability scale shows how willing people are to make themselves sound better and hide their true feelings about a topic when participating in a study like this. So basically, it measures how much people care about what other people think of them, and that comes in with the social desirability scale, because obviously no one wants to admit or express their racial bias. So a similar point system was used for this, in which we asked true or false questions, and each response to the true or false questions were turned into different points in which you can measure at the end of the study. So these are examples of some of the questions that we used for the social desirability scale. And even though they don't directly relate to implicit racial bias, they show how likely people will be to hide their evident racial bias. So in order to keep participants from knowing what we were exactly measuring during the study, we needed to throw them off by asking about sexism. So it used the same point system, but we did not measure them because that's not what our study was about. It was just a way to throw participants off and for them to not know that their implicit racial bias was being measured. So these were just examples of some of the questions. Again, we didn't measure or convert calculations to these answers because they weren't what we were studying, but they were important because we needed to make sure that it wasn't completely evident what we were measuring, so it didn't alter what people were going to say about the answers to the experiment, and we just got their unbiased opinion.
Hey, my name is Lonnie Friedland. I'm going to take you guys through the results and the findings. We conducted a between subjects ANOVA to analyze our data. And what we came up with was that there was a significant effect of the notification, the prior notification in which participants were shown the video about racism prior to answering the questions. There was higher racial stigma found in the group that received prior notification compared to those that were not notified. And this was actually contrary to what our hypothesis had been, and was kind of a surprise to us that the racial stigma was higher when there was prior notification. With regards to anonymity, there was no significant effect determined when compared to those that were anonymous or not anonymous. There was no significant result there. There was also no interaction between our notification between the two independent variables of notification and anonymity. They didn't seem to have any impact on each other, and nor was there a significant relationship between social desirability and racial stigma. So, trying to really explain what these results mean and what it really actually looks like is, if you look at our hypothesis for being notified, our hypothesis held that those that were notified prior and had an idea that the test questionnaires were about racial stigma, we assumed that those that were notified prior would have lower levels of racial stigma, but that was not what we found. We found that those that were notified had higher racial stigma, and these results were significant, which was surprising due to the low power limitation from our small sample size. We didn't have that many people all together, let alone in each of the four groups. So finding a significant relationship here was a pretty big deal, and interestingly contrary to our hypothesis. When it came to our second hypothesis for our second IV, which was anonymity, while these results were not significant, they were marginally close and have a significant trend, which kind of would indicate that had we had a larger sample, we may have ended up having significant results. Also, while the results were not significant, there was a trend that those that were anonymous did report higher levels of racial stigma than those that were not anonymous, which does in fact support our second hypothesis. So what does this all mean? What are the limitations and implications of these results? First, we'd like to start off with some of the limitations that may have impacted our results. As I mentioned earlier, small sample size and varying sample sizes was a limitation of this experiment. Overall, we only had the people in our classroom taking the questionnaire, and also within those people, I'm blowing this, I'm gonna have to do it again. But within those groups, all of them were students at the College of Staten Island attending online classes in the evening. So that could certainly have implications for our results, considering that it's not a true sample of a society. The symbolic racism scale that we used was developed in the year 2000, so that's 24 years ago. So that might be outdated and could use an update to reflect current views. We didn't use all 13 social desirability questions. We limited it to 5 to keep the questionnaire shorter. So perhaps had we used more of those questions, we would have seen a difference in social desirability and the impact there. And then lastly, a couple of the limitations is that the video that we had shown showed that there was racial bias, even in people who identify as African American, and in teachers that were both white and black towards African American students. This video may have had an inadvertent normalization effect, in that people watching it, may have seen that the racism in that video was normal and accepted, and so they were perhaps emboldened to answer the questions in a more racist way. Also, while the questions on sexism may have served to obscure the goal that, hey, we're measuring racial stigma here, it may have still cued people into the fact that we're measuring stigma in general. So in the future, we could potentially include some more random questions that would throw people off even more. So despite these limitations, our findings indicating that being notified about racial bias having a significant effect, what was really quite interesting. This indicates that being notified, oops, sorry, I can't see. Thanks. Could potentially lead to a rebound effect. And this was something that has been seen in prior research as well. In the article Out of Mind but Back in Sight, Stereotypes on the Rebound by McRae et al. And published in 1994, when people attempted to suppress unwanted thoughts, these thoughts are likely to subsequently reappear with even greater insistence than if they had never been suppressed. In other words, the attempt to suppress racial ideas or feelings may end up actually causing them to rebound and come back stronger than they were in the first place. These results could have a really significant impact on concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all the initiatives that go along with them that we're seeing in the workplace and in educational settings. So understanding how these initiatives can lead to a rebound effect can help us make any changes that might make them more impactful. Also, it could be that with a larger sample size, we would have seen a more significant effect of anonymity, and that could help us understand some of the racial stigma that's observed in anonymous environments such as social media. So to wrap it up, we just want to leave you with a couple of questions that may have come up just to keep you thinking about the work that we did here. How are you concerned? Are you concerned about racial bias in your school or your workplace? And how else could we have gone about conducting this study if there were any ideas or suggestions that we could have done to improve upon this initiative to make it more impactful? We'd love to hear it. And that's it. Thank you very much, and thanks for listening.